Let me try. Morocco, Morocco, Namakwa, and local John, that means greetings, everyone. Usa Wayu, Nipiao no. That means good day, my comrades. So we have a guest today here. I have Obi Rivera along with me. And if you can do the honors to introduce our guest.
Absolutely, absolutely. Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Lynne Guitar. She's an esteemed historian and anthropologist who has worked many years in the field of trying to rediscover and trying to expound our ancestral Taino heritage. And she has been instrumental to the research done for us to be able to understand our ethnic origins. So I'd like to take it and give the floor to Lynne so she can give a little bit more insight about herself. And take it away, Lynne.
Okay, well, I'll try to make it short. At age 42, I decided to go back to university. I'd only gone to freshman year. And yeah, so with an adult daughter, I decided to go back to school. And in 9 years, I got 2 BAs simultaneously, a master's and a PhD. The latter two from Vanderbilt University that gave me a free ride. That was wonderful. Anyway, with the quincentennial coming up in 1992, that's what really got me interested in the Taino way back in 92. And I decided I would go back to college and get a degree. I was only going for a bachelor's degree, but yeah. Anyway, I guess what really pushed me into the Taino was visiting the Dominican Republic for the first time in 1992 and coming across a statue that was a statue of Ana Kona. And I thought, wow, what a beautiful, beautiful poetic name. And in fact, it said La Poetisa, the poetess. And that's when I decided that I was going to study the Taino. I was just fascinated by them. And as I say, ever since then, so that was 1992. And I've been, I think, Taino in my heart and soul ever since that trip. Yeah, went to the Dominican Republic, lived in Puerto Rico first for about almost a year. And then, and I've been several times to Spain. But I lived in the Dominican Republic for 22 years, researching all the while that I was working. And I worked with study abroad. At first, I worked with bilingual high school and teaching the upper level classes. And then I worked at Pucamaima, Pontificia Universidad Católica Madre Maestra. And just retired in 2016, and I'm living now in Central Florida. So, and now I get to write, well, you'll hear a little bit more about what I'm writing now at the end of my talk. That's it.
Awesome introduction. And once again, we are very honored to have you in our presence because we understand that you have contributed so much to the community. And for us to be able to understand our background, our ethnic identity, and to be able to grasp that, and because knowledge at the end of the day, it is power. And if you don't know your past, you're not going to understand your future, and you're definitely not going to understand your present. So once again, thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely. I wanted to start by getting into the questions, because these are just these are just questions that the community itself has had a lot of debates about. Not just the community, but also within, as you know, within the anthropology field, as far as our idiosyncratic culture and what makes us uniquely us. So my first question, just to jump right into it, would be, how would you define Native identity? Because that's a big topic, especially nowadays with the advance of genetic testing and DNA. There's a lot of conversation about what constitutes as Native identity. How would you approach that kind of question?
People have always asked me, do I look Indio? And I would say I would never attempt to define anybody's ethnic identity. You end up defining your own ethnic identity, or the multiple ethnicities that you might have among your ancestries. As both an historian and a cultural anthropologist, I never use the term race. I use ethnic or ethnicity. I don't use the term race because I believe the current use of the term is fully wrong. There's only one race, and that's the human race. Okay, so bear with me that I say I don't use that term, that ugly term race, because of what it means today and how it's taken. Anyway, all of you who self-identify as Indigenous, I believe have the right to claim an Indigenous ethnicity, and define that for yourself. You might have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, you know, who, and other relatives who identify as Indigenous and have taught you that you are Indigenous, often that you're Taino. Or maybe they don't identify as Indigenous, but you've done some research or otherwise learned about Indigenous customs and beliefs that members of your family have always followed. So that's one way to identify as Indigenous. DNA today is a reliable scientific method, but it's a method to identify your genetic ancestry. It can't define your culture. It can't really define your ethnicity. And DNA, of course, certainly wasn't around when your great-grandparents or older relatives were practicing the beliefs and the methods that have been passed on down to them, the culture that's been passed down to them and now to you for centuries and centuries. Culture is a very, very, very strong marker of ethnicity. Beware, however, we humans tend to strongly rely upon physical features to define our ethnic heritage. This includes skin color, hair color and texture, the shape, size, and color of our eyes and noses, the structure of our cheekbones, whether we have big or little rear ends. Physical features, however, are the very least reliable of all ethnic markers, even though they're inherited. They're the least reliable ethnic marker. I prefer that people use cultural and ancestral ethnic markers, regardless of DNA results. If you have very little Indigenous DNA, but lots of Indigenous cultural and ancestral ethnic markers, then don't hesitate to self-define yourself as Indigenous, even if you're blonde and blue-eyed.
Excellent.
You're
excellent
welcome.
Answer. Very excellent answer. And I think that puts things into perspective for a lot of people, because it's true. We do rely a lot on phenotype to define what is truly native. And when you live in a multicultural society, we have been for at least the last 500 years since the Columbian exchange. For us, it's very hard sometimes when you are in a space where race and purity is overvalued over culture and ancestral inheritance of that culture. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to start putting value on the importance of culture and what you inherited, because if you inherited Indigenous culture and you continue to practice it to the present day, you have every right to claim your Indigenous identity. Mm-hmm. So that is a perfect answer to that question. And I'd like to also follow up then. That being said, what would be your response then to, because there are critics who make the claim that, Dominicans, for example, due to the fact that our blood quantum is not as high as, for example, those in South America or even in Mesoamerica, how would you answer that? How would you answer that question, that Dominicans cannot claim their Indigenous identity due to their low to medium blood quantum?
Well, first, I would point out that blood quantum was a concept that arose during the colonization of the United States of America, not the Caribbean, not South America. The early colonizers of what became the United States were mainly Europeans from Great Britain and Ireland, and they devised blood quantum to define Native American identity, quote, by degree of affiliation to a tribe in their family ancestry, unquote, according to Wikipedia. The higher your blood quantum, under this concept that arose in the U.S., the lower you supposedly were in status and intelligence. Okay, so the more Indian that was in you, the more the less intelligent you were, and of course then your status was low. The politics of the concept arose from the hope that Native Americans would breed out their Indianness and would no longer have to be supported on Native American reservations. That's where it came from. However, the whole idea, the concept of blood quantum and high and low still remains in US American concept of low status and supposedly low intelligence levels for indigenous peoples all over the world. Very, very, very unfortunately. Long before blood quantum in North America, however, the Spanish colonizers in the Caribbean had a different tactic. They declared that the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean became extinct sometime between the 50s, as the colonizers wanted to bring in more Africans as slaves. They thought that Africans were stronger than the indigenous peoples and less likely to get ill. We know now that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had not been a part on the intercontinental trade that Europeans, Asians, and Africans participated in for centuries before discovering, in quotes, the Western Hemisphere. As for trading items, as well as trading items for profit, however, Europeans, Asians, and Africans for all those centuries interchanged disease bacteria and viruses. Those illnesses killed millions of people in the Eastern Hemisphere, but a small percentage, normally 10 to 20% of people in the of the population, 10 to 20% of the population in all circumstances of epidemics and pandemics are immune to those diseases or live through the illness and develop immunities that they pass on to their progeny. Okay, and that's been studied and studied. Noble David Cook is one of the most fascinating and I think most in-depth researchers in that field, and I studied with him at Florida International University. So for the past 500 years, the early chroniclers and historians since then, even some modern day historians, have continued to declare that the Taino Indians of the Greater Caribbean were long extinct. But it's certain that 10 to 20% of them survived the terrible diseases that were brought to the Western Hemisphere in their ships and have produced many generations of children with immunities to the diseases that killed so many of their kindred. Using that knowledge that 10 to 20% of the original Taino population survived, and I've read all the demography arguments, and I think it was the higher amount that were in the Caribbean. So I use those two pieces of knowledge together. Know that historians, no matter when or where they write and promote their ideas, have multiple motives for writing what and whom they write about and whom they leave out of their histories. They also have specific audiences whom they were or still are attempting to inform whatever it is that they want their readers to believe. That's important to remember. For example, the chroniclers of the so-called Age of Discovery wanted to bring in more and more Africans as slaves, so they lied. They outright lied in their documents that were sent to Spain, and they said that they had very, very few indios remaining in their control. Back in the late 1980s, I was the first professional historian to prove, with hundreds and hundreds of colonial era documents to back up my claims, that the Taino were never, ever extinct. They were reduced in numbers, yes, and neglected or purposefully left out of the histories of various South American and Caribbean nations, including the Dominican Republic, but they were never extinct. Tainos were never provided with reservations, like in North America, but they moved into difficult to reach, mountainous, and often desolate regions in the northern, eastern, and western reaches of the island that is now called Hispaniola, regions that were far from the capital of Santo Domingo on the south coast, where the Spaniards had concentrated their populations. I'll talk a little more about this in a couple of minutes, but isolating themselves from others is the first clue as to how Taino peoples have retained many of their cultural traits and beliefs through the present day.
Once again, very in-depth and excellent answer. And it does provide a lot of insight into our past, because a lot of the issues surrounding identity nowadays has to do with the fact that, you know, we are a multicultural society. We are heavily mixed now. And sometimes it might be hard to identify what specifically from the Tainos we have inherited. But it is very good that you put that into perspective, that it is important for historians. Historians have a responsibility to make sure that the correct history is told. And often, because a lot of us, you know, nowadays are born here in the United States as opposed to being born in the Dominican Republic, our history seems to start out of nowhere with Christopher Columbus came and he went, and then we fast forward and we skip such a big part of the history, because the current history starts in the Caribbean and it's so overlooked. So it's really good that anthropologists and historians like yourself are truly bringing this to light. And as right now, I would like to turn this over to my colleague, Peter, because I'm pretty sure he has a bunch of questions for you as well. And he's ready to get in the ring, as we say. So take it away, Peter.
Yeah, so this next question is very simple, and I believe would be very important to a lot of people. So my question is, so who were the Taino, and how do the Taino live today through modern day descendants?
Okay, I'm going to approach this one way because I'm not a specialist on the modern day Taino, the modern day descendants. I'm a specialist on the Classic Taino, but I can tell you how the culture still lives on through those modern day descendants. But first, the first part of your question, who were the Taino? The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, who used to be called Island Arawak because it was believed that that was the base of their language, are collectively called Taino today. They were the first Native Americans to discover Christopher Columbus. I always like to point that out. You must take the indigenous view of that, and not that Columbus discovered them.
Correct.
The Taino people, their languages and cultures did not evolve in mainland South America, which so many people think. That was then called tierra firme, you know, the firm earth, the solid earth. They evolved in the Caribbean as population pressure, principally along the Orinoco and Amazon River basins, pushed multiple peoples out of the northeastern regions of South America and into the Caribbean islands. These various indigenous peoples began to adapt the most beneficial knowledge and skills of the other peoples around them in the islands. In the Greater Antilles, they became loosely united and widely known and looked up to as incredible artists, agriculturalists, fishermen, mariners, and traders. These waves of indigenous groups thrived and continued to evolve in the Caribbean islands over thousands of years. By the late 1400s, most anthropologists agree the people we call Taino had evolved into a state-level, peaceably unified people, despite occasional squabbles, of course, and they were the best-known traders in the Caribbean. We call their combined pre-Columbian culture Classic Taino, and in the late 1400s, they were about to move up to the anthropological category of nation level. Classic Taino were centered among the islands of Quisqueya, called Hispaniola today and shared by the Dominican Republic and the Republic of Haiti, as well as Boriquen, Puerto Rico, Cubao, Cuba, Jamajé, Jamaica, and the Lucayos, which were comprised of the Bahamas, Turks, and Caicos. Classic Taino were the major and most advanced Native Americans in the Caribbean. They lived in relative peace and plenty until the arrival of Columbus and his Spanish companions. The Spaniards would steal their lands, enslave, overwork, underfeed, rape, and kill these indigenous peoples, and then take away their very identity by erroneously declaring them extinct by the 1530s to 1550s. Today, thousands of Taino descendants still live across the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, where many of them are known as Jivaros, mountain people, Cuba, Jamaica, and other islands in the Greater Antilles, many without knowing about their Taino ancestry because historians wrote them out of history, which my dear friend and longtime co-researcher Jorge Esteves calls paper genocide. Thousands more Taino descendants have emigrated to or been born in many different regions of the world, including South America, Central America, Spain, France, Great Britain, and of course, mainland USA, as well as today in Alaska and Hawaii. But especially the Tainos survive today and their ancestors in New England, and more recently in Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas. These descendants of the Taino are eager to learn more about their ancestors and ancestral cultures.
That was a great perspective, Lynn. And I think that's going to go into the next question, which I would like to get straight into it. If you can please explain how the first interactions between the Taínos and the Spanish had led to cultural influences later in Dominican culture today.
Sure. That's a fairly easy question to answer. The European colonizers did not know how to live in the tropics. They didn't know what was safe to eat versus what was poisonous. They didn't know what or when to plant, when and what to hunt, or how to preserve or cook food, the local foods, nor did they know how to protect themselves against hurricanes or what wind and ocean currents would take them to the surrounding islands. They didn't know what kind of housing was best in the tropics or how to build such houses. They had to learn everything about Caribbean life from the indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. And that education ended up introducing Taino words into Spanish, English, and other non-indigenous languages, for there were no European words for things they had never seen or experienced before. Therefore, I believe that Taino culture is the foundation of Dominican culture, as well as the foundation of Puerto Rican, Cuban, and other Caribbean cultures, with additions of the culture from European, African, and more recently US cultures. You can see this in Dominican and other Caribbean people's languages, in their dynamic musical forms and instruments that are dominated by drums and other percussion instruments, and their appreciation for music, which accompanies all Dominican cultural events and activities. Many of their homes, especially those of the poor, are still built like Taino houses, many which that kind of a house may not withstand hurricane winds, but they're easy and cheap to replace after a storm. Dominican foodways, as well as the foodways of other Caribbean peoples, are chock full of delicious and nutritious foods that the foreign colonists were taught to grow and prepare by the indigenous peoples of the islands. Having lived and worked in the Dominican Republic for 22 years, and being retired now and living in Central Florida, which doesn't even have very many Hispanics, I can't even describe how very, very much I miss cassave, guandules, stewed habichuelas, fresh fish with coconut sauce, auyama, and all the delicious víveres. Víveres like yuca, yautía. My favorite of the yautía is yautía coco, which when cooked is so delicious and lavender colored. There's also
me hungry.
Yeah, the sweet batata, llames, mapue, and don't forget lerenes, which are only available around Christmas. I love lerenes.
Yes.
And I miss all the incredible fruits that I can't get stateside. The guavas, chinolas, which always were a favorite when my grandsons came to visit and when US students came to study abroad. Guanábanas, cherimoyas, pitahayas, limoncillos, called canepas in Puerto Rico, granadillas, carambolas, nísperos, and zapotes, my personal favorite fruit. Finally, anana, which is Taino for pineapples, and is by far the most popular fruit to come out of the indigenous Caribbean. All of these delicious and nutritious fruits were introduced to Europeans by the Taino. Some of you might know that up in New England, pineapples were served for dessert by the elites of colonial Boston. and they represented the North American height of luxury and welcome. But I found it hilarious that Columbus took several bushels of pineapples back to Spain on the return of his first voyage. Only a small basket of pineapples survived the journey. Queen Isabella was late in the afternoon that Columbus was introducing the luscious fruit to the royalty. And although King Ferdinand was very reluctant to taste the strange looking ananá, he ended up liking them so much that he ate that entire little basket full. The Queen had to wait to try pineapple when Columbus returned from his next voyage. Or that's the story that was told around the court and written down. But there's so much more that Dominican culture and Caribbean culture in general owes to the Taino than an appreciation for music that's so rhythmic it moves you in both body and soul, and delicious, nutritious foods and fruits. For example, the Taino were notably friendly and happy people, a trait that Dominicans, in fact, nearly all Caribbean people, are famous for even today. And child raising among Caribbean peoples is not strict like it is in most European cultures. The relationships among adults, as well as relationships between adults and children, are loving and playful, just as these relationships were among the Taino. And they were deeply, deeply spiritual, the Taino, as most Dominicans are today. There are lots and lots of other commonalities between Taino culture and Dominican culture today, but I don't have time for them all. I do have to share one more, however, or I found it fascinating, if not a little abhorrent. The Taino bathed several times a day, as do the majority of Dominicans. The Taino bathe several times a day, and so do Dominicans today. But Europeans of the 1500s and 1600s generally bathed just once a year. Queen Isabella issued a law that all encomenderos, those who had indios in the Caribbean who were commended to their care in return for their work, of course, these encomenderos had to try to keep their indios from bathing too frequently by law. Why? Because the Queen and her countrymen believed that bathing removed the dirt and sweat from your bodies, which was protecting you from getting ill. It kind of makes it hard to imagine a Taino woman enjoying making love to a Spaniard, doesn't it? Until or unless she could teach him to enjoy frequent baths.
Oof. I don't know how she dealt with that.
No, me neither. Oh, I can't imagine how somebody would smell after working and sweating for a year.
Especially traveling for a year back and forth via boat and ship. That has to be that. It makes you appreciate certain things in the 21st century as opposed to the 16th. For sure.
Yes. Okay.
Well, Peter, do you have any follow-up that you would like to ask our esteemed guest?
I think Miss Guitar explained everything very, very well, and I think it's going to benefit a lot from the community. They're going to get a lot of understanding and clarity for this. So no further questions for me.
Okay.
I think all of your answers have been very comprehensive and detailed, and that's really what we're looking for, because as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be amongst Dominicans in certain ways like this amnesia of not really understanding where certain elements of our culture comes from and how that contributes fundamentally to who we are today. And understanding the history, understanding the early history, especially the early pre-Columbian history, is important to us reclaiming and understanding our modern day identity. And it is, I do remember reading also, it is true that the Spaniards did have some particular weird interests. They had some weird interests when it came to medicine and what they thought was proper in preserving their health and and their identity as Spaniards. I remember researching that the Spaniards were so terrified early on. They were very terrified of eating foods that were related to the Taínos, and even were willing to get scurvy and die from scurvy because they thought that if they started eating foods that were related to the Taínos, they would wind up looking like Tainos, losing their beard, which was like the essence of their manhood, and completely because they saw Tainos unfortunately in an inferior people. So they thought, oh, well, if I eat these foreign foods, I will become like them. And it goes into the insight of 16th century early colonial thinking and how that has affected us to the present day with honoring our indigenous heritage, which has a rightful place in history, not only just for us, but as you pointed out with the pineapple, for the entire world, because it is true. The pineapple was seen as a symbol of luxury. Of famous kings all the way from France through Germany were known to have iconography of the pineapple, and that was through the exportation of this fruit from our lands.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very important, and all the work you've done, it is extremely important to continue this work so that Dominicans hold their history in a bountiful way. They're able to understand the complexities and the totality of our history so we can better understand ourselves. So following up with that, we're going to get to the nitty gritty, because we do want to announce that you are also the author. You've written various things based on the Tainos, and one of the most important things based on the Tainos is your Taíno ni rahú series. So can you please explain the motivation behind writing your books?
I sure can. My first books are actually a series, as you said, Taíno ni rahú, which means Taino, children of the water. And they're a series of 10 Spanish-English bilingual books for young readers. But I define that category of young readers as readers between the ages of 10 and 110. You got to keep in mind that for more than 30 years, I wrote historical books and historical articles, mostly for professional historical journals. The truth is, not many people read those professional journals. They're often very boring. When I retired in 2016, I vowed to write historical fiction. Historical fiction, I believe, attracts more readers than the often boring professional works. And if done well, it can be very informative, which I believe my books are. These 10 books, which should be read consecutively, numbers 1 through 10, are about a Taino brother and sister, ages 10 and 12, respectively, who live in a small Taino fishing village that still exists, just west of today's Santo Domingo. The books cover in detail their activities and adventures, and of course their culture, from late October of 1488, just 4 years before the arrival of Columbus and the Spaniards, and their founding at ages 16 and 14, by which they were considered adults, of a new cacicazgo, a new chiefdom, in what today is the region Lago Enriquillo. All 10 books in the series are available on Amazon or from me directly. And then I have a brand new book that I just released in September. It's called Taíno Ceremonies, Myths, Rituals, and Zemís. Zemís are ancestral spirit guides. These are not historical fiction. They're historical. A dozen or more times every year, I receive requests to answer questions about the Taino and their culture, and I'm very pleased to do so. This past year, I gave an online presentation for the Iguagua group about the role of women among the Classic Taino. Shortly thereafter, I received a request from a young Taino descendant named Cristal Vélez, who sought resources about Taíno Zemís for a book she hoped to write for young children. In the course of sending her resources, I rediscovered a PowerPoint show that I researched and presented several times in the Dominican Republic right about when she was born, about 20 years ago. I realized that many of the questions I received over the years were for knowledge about what was covered in that presentation. So I updated it and I published it this past September as an amply illustrated full-color bilingual book available on Amazon or by contacting me directly via my email, which I'll provide in a minute right now. Okay, my time for the actual interview today is over, but and I really truly hope that I've answered at least some of your questions. The audience, you can always email me. My email is Lynne Guitar That's LYNNEGUITAR @yahoo.com. So mil gracias. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lynn, for participating in this project to bring light to these very, very important topics. And just like to reach out to the community, please check out all 10 of her books, and her series, as she stated, is definitely available on Amazon. It is very important that our children and our future descendants understand where they come from and have a clear understanding of their ancestors' histories and what they went through for us to be where we are today and to be who we are today.
Yeah.
So with that said, I'll pass it on to Peter for any closing statements.
So that's all for today. I will provide a link to Ms. Guitar's books down below, as well as her email if you would like to ask her questions or inquiries regarding her published works. Again, I would like to thank you again for participating in this discussion. And until next time, Wahiba, we will conversate.